when I was a student still, I read Martin Gardner's columns along with all the other sort of scientific students, really. And he wrote this column for many years in the Scientific American called Mathematical Games, and he would discuss various things. And my friends and I read this column and played the games, with each other and so on. And then I started writing to Martin, and in the end, what happened was this. I would keep a roll of paper in my typewriter, a good old-fashioned typewriter, sit-up and beg type typewriter, and every now and then I'd say something that was interesting us. Maybe a comment on Martin's last month's column, maybe some kind of game or puzzle that we were playing with, and so on. And then I'd write a page or so and turn the roll of paper around and so on. And when it got to a suitable length of 5 or 6 feet, I would sort of fold it up, rip it out of the typewriter, fold it up, and send it off to Martin Gardner. And then he started using these things as filler for his column. He did an amazing thing. He wasn't a mathematician. He didn't have a mathematical or indeed a particularly scientific education. He did philosophy at Chicago. But he wrote this initial article on hexaflexagons, little folded pieces of paper, which wasn't one of his columns, actually. It was an article in the body of the magazine. But it got more mail than any previous article in that magazine. So the editors asked him, could he have a regular column, conduct a regular column? And he was short of money and interest and so on, and so he said yes and launched himself off into this column, which he conducted rather wonderfully. He conducted this column essentially by having correspondence with a number of people who, wrote to him after reading his columns, no doubt, and so on, with particular mathematical problems suitable for the column, and then he would digest what they said. And he used me, which really I suppose meant me and the people I was collaborating with in Cambridge. Every now and then, he would just look at one of these screeds of paper I sent him, again, every now and then.
With comment on previous articles? With
comments on previous articles or on what we'd been thinking of, some ingenious little puzzle or something. That lasted a long, long time. And then I got into the habit of going to see Martin when I sort of grew up and got a job at Cambridge and so on. I travelled across the Atlantic once every 1 or 2 years, roughly speaking, and I would stop at his place. At that time he had a nice address for somebody writing a mathematics column, 10 Euclid Avenue, Hastings-on-Hudson, New York. The first time I met him was very interesting. I took the train up and he met me at the station there and took me back home to his house, and then he had to collect his 2 teenage boys from school. So he took me up to what he called his den at the top of his house.
Left you there?
And left me there. It said, I'll be back in half an hour or something. And he said, you can play with anything you like.
What did he have in there?
Well, he had all sorts of toys. Well, what I did, I pulled open a little drawer which was above a semicircular table that sort of stood out from the wall at one point. And I got a real shock. I almost screamed because a mechanical insect jumped out. And then it sort of walked to the edge of the table, and then it sort of felt around. There wasn't any more table, so it turned around and walked in a different direction. And this thing, very, very simple device, this thing walked around until its clockwork ran down, you know. And that was a very nice little thing. But anyway, there were all sorts of toys in his den at the top, and his wonderful collection of 3x5 index cards, which sort of organised all his writings on such things. He came back, and we went out to dinner. He had one or two people who were interested in meeting me and so on. And we made up a little party of 6 or 8 people. And we went to this restaurant in Dobbs Ferry. And it was a very sort of cheap place. There was a big deal table. Deal is the appropriate word, actually, because the waitress came round, an Irish waitress came round, and she dealt plates onto the table. And these plates came with something of a clatter, you know. And then she came round and dealt cutlery, knives and forks and things onto the table. Not carefully placing them, but, you know, here's a knife, fork and spoon for this person and then for this person. And Martin picked up his knife, fork and spoon, and he picked up his plate, and he dropped the knife and the fork and the spoon. They went right through the plate and landed on the table beneath. Well, of course, they didn't really go right through the plate. I'm describing the effect, what people saw, you know. Well, this waitress screamed. And Martin sort of looked around, you know, something strange happened. And then he picked his cutlery up again, and this time he sort of threw them through the plate, and they landed underneath it, and we all looked. And then he gathered everybody's cutlery and sent it in a continuous stream through the plate, and it piled up in a great heap underneath it. And I said to Martin, you must show me how to do that sometime. And he said, later, you know. And but then he never actually, oh, he did say, I'll tell you something about it right now. It was pretty dark in that restaurant, and I wouldn't have done it had it not been dark. But then he forgot to tell me that time, and
so that's all you know.
To ask him. And on some later occasion, he didn't know which trick it was he'd performed. He knew dozens of tricks, or thousands really. You know, he used to write in magic magazines, and one thing I discovered is that professional magicians had the same reverent attitude to Martin Gardner. They all read his columns in magic magazines at the time we were reading his columns in the Scientific American. He was a very, very learned man. I was reading one of his books only the other day, and I was struck by how much that guy knew about science, philosophy, you know, essentially everything. Very, very knowledgeable guy. Martin's birthday was October the 21st, I think, his 95th birthday last year. And this man at the publisher, whose name was Peter Rents, and I'd known him a long time ago, telephoned and asked me for a blurb for a new collection of Martin Gardner's columns. And he wanted to get it out in time for Martin's 95th birthday. I don't know whether they did get it out or not. Martin was actually collaborating on it. He kept on writing stuff, you know, right up till the day he died, practically. And Siobhan and I, Siobhan Roberts, who's writing my life story, we were going to see him after the last gathering for Gardner, which was in March of last year. She telephoned him to make final arrangements and got instead the director of the assisted living facility where he spent the last few years. And she said he'd died the day before. So it's quite interesting. You know, another woman telephoned me later the same day, which was a Sunday, and said, you know, Martin Gardner's dead. And I said, yes, I know, I just heard. That was on the Sunday, he died on the Saturday. And on the Monday, we read his obituary in the New York Times. Some of us did, anyway. Yeah, I miss that man. I was really looking forward to seeing him again. I haven't seen him for about 10 years, before that. But it was always enjoyable, and he would show me a new trick, and so on. Every now and then I showed him a new trick. But there was another thing, He taught me once how to tie a piece of string into a knot without leaving go of the ends. Well, again, one can't really do that, but it's how to make it seem that you're doing that. And we were chatting once, and he said, "Oh, there's a new way of doing that," he said. And he took this piece of string and went, "Ooh," and there was a knot in the thing. I said, "Martin, you must show me how to do that, And I was mindful of this time when he had promised to show me how to do this other trick, and it never worked. So he said, "Okay, yes, don't worry, I'll show it to you now." And he did show it to me. And I practiced it. I could do it pretty well, The trouble is, I forgot to do it again. With these tricks that involve some cunning motion of the hands contain the memory. It's no good sort of remembering the description of what goes on. You sort of do it until you practice it often enough. You've got to practice it sort of 20 times the first day, and then 10 times each day for a week, and then once a day for the next of the month, and so on. And then you've got to do it every month for the rest of your life, roughly speaking, if you had to remember it. And I didn't do that, and I realized, oh my God, I've lost it again, That was really nice. Yes, tantalizing. Martin was always full of ingenious new ideas and tricks and so on, not necessarily his own. Oh yes, I remember one other occasion, the day of the week business. I don't know whether I dare to do it with no preparation. What date were you born?
15th of November, 1958.
Yes, okay, that was a Saturday.
That's right.
So I can still do it. How that came about is quite interesting. It was on one of my visits to Martin Gardner, and I got off the plane. It was at Kennedy Airport. It may have been so long ago that it was still called Idlewild. I don't really remember. And there was no Martin there. And I didn't know what to do. I'm most disorganized sort of person. My life is perpetual chaos. I walk in a cloud of chaos that always surrounds me. I didn't know a telephone number for Martin Gardner, nor how to get one. And even if I knew one, I wouldn't have quite known how to handle the American telephone system, phones with, coin slots and all that sort of stuff. So I sort of thought, I'll wait for an hour or two. Well, of course, I thought that after waiting for a quarter of an hour already, Then I was trying to think of people I would know somewhere in New York who I could stay with if necessary. Anyway, I waited and waited and waited, and eventually, I think it was almost 2 hours later that Martin arrived, and he dashed up. He was out of breath. He said, I'm sorry, but when you've heard what I've found, you'll forgive me. I said, Martin, there's no question of forgiveness, I mean, people have to forgive me every time for forgetting things, and if I demanded forgiveness from them proportionally, it would be terrible. It turned out that he'd been in the New York Public Library on 42nd Street, I think it was. And he had discovered an article by Lewis Carroll in Nature, which is now a serious scientific journal, but then was like Popular Mechanics, if Popular Mechanics still exists, or even if it doesn't. And it gave a rather simple rule for working out the day of the week. And Martin knew that the sort of Lewis Carroll fans didn't know about this article. So it was a new bibliographic discovery about Lewis Carroll. And he knew that because he was high up in the Lewis Carroll
And
Society.
he wrote the annotated Alice.
Yes, he wrote the annotated Alice and various other things. He published an annotated edition of The Snark, too. Anyway, so he knew they didn't know about it, and then he stood in line for the copying machine. This was in the days before Xerox machines. I don't quite know what kind of copying machine it was. And then as he stood in line, he realized he was going to be late to meet me. But by that time, he'd invested half an hour of his time in the line and moved quite some distance up in it. And so he thought, well, I'll just stay so much more. It would be a pity to throw this time away, and so on. And it went on happening. You know, when he was just outside the copying room door, you know, he thought, oh God, I really must go. But then he stayed a bit and so on. And he told me all this as we were sort of zipping ourselves into
And his interest was
car.
because it was by Lewis Carroll,
Yeah.
not that it's an algorithm for the day of the week.
Yes, but it, you know, as we zipped ourselves into his car, he handed it me to have a look at, and he said, you know, it's a rather interesting way of doing this. You know, in his filing cabinet, he had a large number of 3x5 index cards, and when we got to his den this time, we looked, you know, for rules for working out the day of the week for any given date, and we found about 20 of them. And you know, we examined them, and this Lewis Carroll one was better than any of them. And but then Martin, as we were driving along, said, you know, John, you ought to work out a rule that's really easy and that I can teach my readers. Now, I had worked out a rule when I was a high school student, you know, but it wasn't all that easy, and it demanded a certain amount of arithmetic and so on. So anyway, I took this challenge seriously.